we have a final plenary, which is a fireside chat. We're trying different formats. And so it's my pleasure to introduce Sean Gallagher, from Northeastern University Global Network, and Kathleen Delaski from the Education Design Lab. And Kathleen is going to interview Sean on the future of university credentials, which comes on the heel of a book and lots of research on that very topic. So please join me in welcome.
Thank you. Great. Yep. Thanks very much. Okay, our mic's hot. We didn't get to test them.
That's right. There's no fire. Fireside chat. We don't need a fire.
Yeah, that's right.
We have,
in fact, some of you probably can't see us, so I don't know what we do about this. If there's any way to see. Are you guys okay? We can stand up. Okay. Well, thank you. I'm Kathleen Delaski. So I think I was asked to do this this interview, Matt, because we're going to be doing a session. The lab is doing a session after lunch, and I feel like Jeff gave us a great commercial, because it's really, we've been working for the past 3 years with several universities around actually beginning to put into action creating digital badges for soft skills. So come see us after lunch and we'll talk about that and debate those finer topics. But this morning, I'm really honored to be able to interview you, Sean, because you are definitely, your university, Northeastern, is really the leader in thinking about how to begin to help students interact with employers and also align their skill sets so that they are marketable after college. So Northeastern's co-op program, if you're not aware of it, is literally the best in the country. You've been at the center of that in your role. So is that, how does, from that perspective, why did you write the book? Was it because of your work with employers?
Yeah, so and thank you, Parchment. It's a real honor to be here today. I see a number of individuals in attendance, right? Thought leaders, other experts in the field, people I quote in the book and have interviewed. So it's a real honor to have this conversation. But yeah, the book comes both out of practice and out of original new research with employers. And its main emphasis and contribution and my own personal focus in terms of scholarship is on that employer side of the equation that's been so neglected, right? Mm-hmm. First of all, there's so much important work to be done in higher education and in policy, right, considering those employer and workforce dynamics that we're already talking about. But then beyond that, what's that intelligence out of the employer side of the ecosystem, the data, the trends, the experiments. Historically, there hasn't been enough of that happening, or it's been happening in pockets. It's been happening in career services or with vocationally focused institutions. But particularly for the largest segments of the higher education market, you have liberal arts degrees, you have research universities, big institutions, right? Our system isn't oriented toward bringing the voice of the employer in. And so having observed some of those gaps and wanting to spark that dialogue and spark that cooperation between employers and universities, that really spawned looking at the data, doing new interviews, and doing the book. And at Northeastern, I've been privileged to participate in some pretty unique initiatives where we have expanded to Seattle, Silicon Valley, Toronto, Charlotte, and I led a lot of that effort, and that involved sitting down and meeting with hundreds of hiring managers, HR leaders, and understanding what did they need, would a new university complement the existing supply and contribute to their community. And it was just a fascinating set of discussions, and wanted to bring some of those learnings to the higher ed field at large. And
does what they need from what you have learned over all those interviews around the country track with what Jeff's telling us?
Yes, very, very consistent. He had some great data and perspective in there. And one thing that I'd point out, which many are probably aware of, is it's just so interesting that many of these discussions or debates, not that we're debating, but out there in the world about our sector, higher education, are polarized, right? And so you have liberal arts versus technical, right? Mm-hmm. Or STEM versus liberal arts, traditional approaches versus new and versus online. And the reality by almost any measure, whether you're talking to employers, whether you're looking at what students are enrolling in, whether you look at which kinds of institutions are growing, which kinds of offerings are growing, is in this vast middle ground that's not as polarized as it's made out to be. And so indeed, when you talk particularly with technology employers, right? So the fastest growing jobs with the greatest volume, the most job openings are in areas like software development and analytics, hundreds of thousands of open positions. And whether it's boot camps or the 50+ university programs that did not exist 6 years ago. In fact, there may actually be more than 100 today in domains like analytics and data science. They're trying to meet that gap. But what's fascinating is employment in that kind of highly technical, specialized field is not limited to the Googles and the Ubers of the world. It's hospitals. I was stunned to find out museums and small nonprofit organizations, they want to analyze their customer data and they need people to look at ticketing information and think about new digital marketing approaches. So the technological change in the economy is creating all this demand for new sorts of credentials and new sorts of programs. But then when you go into the high-tech employers in particular, what you often hear is not only can they not find enough engineers and computer scientists, as well as people to work in business, accounting, HR, or wherever, but they can't find individuals that can also think critically, work in a team. That's one of the things that employers, I think, appreciate about online education is often that involves collaborating across teams and with people around the world.
So it sounds like there's two kinds of opportunities and two kinds of maybe pressures that are pushing or creating opportunities for new kinds of credentials in the college marketplace. One is really the technical, really new types of technical skills that need to be discerned and displayed. Is that right? And then the second would be really these maybe cross-functional skills, universal skills, 21st century skills that currently the resume is too one-dimensional, and just listing your activities that you do co-curricularly isn't cutting it for employers. Is that a fair? Are those the two areas?
Well, on the last piece, I thought it was great that Jeff Salingo noted the dynamics between education and experience. So what I've looked at in my book and in my research is, we're all convened here in such an exciting discussion around the term credential, right? Credential can be a noun. You can think about credential, to credential as a verb, et cetera. And let's unpack what that means, right? How do students and professionals present hiring qualifications in the marketplace? How do employers actually hire? We don't know a lot, right? There's new research, but we don't know as much as you think about how that process actually works.
Right.
And that process works, it's working in a changing and fast-paced way, and it's also very decentralized and distributed. So one core point, just so we don't forget it, is that blend between experience and education, and that the boundaries are blurring. And if you look at the new micro-credentials that are coming out of for-profit startup companies and also colleges and universities, if you look at the most successful and scaling online education programs, et cetera, a lot of the momentum is for offerings that also have a project or an experience that's interwoven with it, because the employer values not only the educational credential and the certification of skill and acumen, or however you frame it, but also the fact that, hey, I know this person can do and has applied this, and so there's value there. On the other point, there's really been a specialization in the economy, and that's, I think, where you see a lot of the growth in new forms of credentials and existing credentials, is in specialized areas, and a lot of it is, there's continuing important work to be done at the sub-baccalaureate level, and we can talk about, are there ways that we could substitute for degrees because we want things that are more affordable, more relevant, and shorter. But something I've been trying to shine a light on is when you look at the job growth, the enrollment growth, the employer pressures, et cetera, there's an even bigger or additional societal issue that so much of the growth is toward what I call the higher end or the top half, right? A lot of good discussion about middle skills, but when you look at the college wage premium, it's been driven by advanced degrees, right? The bachelor's degree has become the baseline. It's kind of holding steady, maybe declining a little bit in terms of the earnings premium. But when you talk to employers, they talk about how that now gets you in the door, and it's critical, and it's not always working, right? Degrees aren't perfect, but so much of this marketplace is actually still also about the degree, and how can we reinvent that experience? Need it be 4 years? Need it be 120 credits? How do we get people post-baccalaureate learning, right? Master's degree enrollment has been booming, and the salary premiums and other data are there to support that that's actually valued by employers. Different groups have done surveys and studies on that. It's not just necessarily credential inflation. MOOCs, boot camps, 80% of people participating in those sorts of things already have a bachelor's degree. So as Jeff spoke to, this is a lifelong learning world, and there's a lot of demand for post-baccalaureate education.
So let's talk about students. So I know the lab, I got into this game, and we're doing the work because we see it as an affordable, we see sub-degree credentials as both an affordability tool and an access tool for students who either, as Jeff said, didn't finish college. It potentially gives them the re-entry ticket or an exit ticket for people who drop out. Is there something that can define your learning and credential it for employers if you are not doing the traditional degree path? Do you think, is there promise as an affordability and equity tool for sub-degree credentials?
Absolutely. I have to admit, I haven't focused as much on the sort of the lower income parts of the job market, where I know a lot of organizations, like, that's their mission. Certainly that's where there's a history of kind of shorter form sub-baccalaureate education that can have some value. A lot of this, I love hearing the word ecosystem, right? It comes down to the ecosystem, not just the colleges and universities. There's plenty of work for higher ed to do, nor also just them working with employers. But what are the other parts of the ecosystem, right? Obviously you have students, but you have kind of platforms and architectures and policies. You have regulation. You have quality assurance and accreditation. So you can think about it as 6 or 7 different zones or parties, right? So if you're a student or a professional and you're presenting a credential, you're completing an educational experience, right? And well, how does that have value? What's that mean? How's it work? What are the protocols and the mechanics? You can break down each piece and say, okay, well, what does it mean to have a learning experience? We're changing and evolving what education is and what credit is, and boundaries are blurring. How do you actually do it in a technological sense, right? There's just such an opportunity, and we're seeing it with Parchment and many others, in terms of new technologies and platforms to be able to capture this data, to share it, to make it transparent.
Well, let's talk about that, because I think a lot of the folks in this room are ecosystem specialists. And you say, I'll quote from the book, the ability of students to mix and match a set of episodic learning experiences and episodic micro-credentials via a portfolio and present it as a hiring qualification is many, many years away. That was more manys than I'd hoped you'd put in the in that phrase, because to me that's the promise of this learner-driven revolution, where you have the Sherpas that Jeff talked about, kind of helping you pick off the menu of different experiences, from different colleges, from new learning institutions, from Straighter Line back there, Burke's here, and different pieces that put together your journey, and that becomes not only a record for you, but also really a development plan, like an IEP. That's the vision that I think a lot of us get excited about, and may have brought some of us to fly in for this meeting today. But this ecosystem, let's talk about the ecosystem we need to create to do that. Employers are difficult to get to the table. I know we found that in our work. They'll tell you what they don't like. It's like Justice Potter's definition of pornography. I'll know it when I see it. The digital credential that they want to accept. But what do we need to do to get employers to the table? What do you think it will take?
Right. Well, that's a key point. Employers. There's kind of a paradox with employers where, on one hand, in higher ed, we might assume that they're extremely advanced, that they're doing competency-based hiring, that they have their act together, that they have people dedicated to this who can interface with universities. In most cases, I'd say they don't necessarily, even massive corporations. Many do, right? They do it very well. But talent and HR has been rising up the list of sort of employer priorities in the corporate agenda. I think it's PwC does an annual CEO survey. And talent management, talent strategy, that is now on the top of board agendas at many companies, because we have a globalized, fast-moving market. We have skills gaps in a very tight job market. And this is knowledge and service work. So human capital is paramount, and it is now much more important for companies. I'll use the term company, but we're also talking about hospitals, schools, et cetera, to be attentive to developing their talent through learning and development, and also how they're hiring. So as has already been signaled a little bit, they're starting to invest in talent analytics, et cetera. But we need to create more like this and like other initiatives, more dialogues, more interfaces. Some of that could be through technology platforms, right? And that's really interesting to consider. Where might the value end up being captured? Is it going to be a LinkedIn or another company that's going to own all this data, that's going to sort of match and be the arbiter between the student, the professional, and the employer. But as we were talking about prior to today, what happens then if that's all in a black box? And so
Right.
there's just
But currently it is in a
opportunities.
black box when individual organizations and companies are doing this, right? They have the XQ test that you could take, the personality test. It tells you whether you get the job, but the student and the school that's supporting the student has no information about what got you hired.
Right, and speaking the same language, right? There's so much work we can do just at this high level of, well, what's problem solving? And can we get the right technical skills? And how about critical thinking and communication? And those are pretty broad concepts. But in terms of, I like to think of competency-based education in kind of a literal way, right? In its broadest sense of education that's aligned with outcomes. They could often be professional outcomes. They don't have to be necessarily. Much more of an outcome orientation, much more of a transparency. That could be part of the quote-unquote credential. It could be part of a digital record. But whether you're an undergraduate, let's imagine, and you happen to have the opportunity to study in the kind of old school, traditional, expensive way. You go away to a leafy campus and you study for 4 years, maybe have an internship. Even in those sorts of programs, I think we're going to see people come out with an augmented credential. Matthew's talked about this in terms of badging, right? Whether it's the term badging or not, that survives. The idea that we're breaking down at a micro level the skills, the competencies, the outcomes, the understanding, and then we can document it in some form. Right now, or historically, if we just throw a portfolio or a detailed transcript at an employer, we need to be sure that we're aligned in terms of what the language is and what the rubrics are.
Right, if it's all going to be machine read, or if we're already there, right? I mean, employers tell us in our work that it's that filtering process where they need the help. People, a lot of us are focused on portfolios to help a student display well at the interview, but only 3 or 5 people are going to get to that interview. So our focus, it seems, should be on the filtering process. How do you help students get through that that funnel? If that's the case, what does that signal for what we should be helping students create? How do we translate? How do we know what employers want, or how do we aggregate them to tell us the right signals that you need in this machine age?
Right. Well, some of it's happening through real-time job market analytic systems like Burning Glass and others. So that's been a nice development.
Yes, but I don't feel that universities, do you, are necessarily getting that message and doing anything with it for their students?
So we have these ways that even if you have all the information, a lot of this is appropriately framed as an information problem, right? And communication between the two sides or the parties in the ecosystem. But even if you had perfect information, something that I emphasize and now I've seen in working in institutions as an administrator and a consultant, is it's cultural change, right? Certainly not all universities, colleges, and others are structured or have the culture, the resources, right, the philosophy to take advantage of and to put the employer voice and dynamics into their programs.
Right.
So I think that's a key piece, as simple as it is. Think about advisory boards, right? Advisory boards are probably a useful first step. Many programs have them, not all, but that's rather basic compared to how can you actively design a program in concert with employers. Will the academy value and appreciate that? Faculty in many cases, in terms of at least what the tradition has been and the orientation, that's starting to evolve.
So students are the woman from American University who stood up and said, our students are still programmed to think about this, the degree as one box, and that they're not thinking about breaking down the skills and figuring out how to communicate those to employers. And we see this too when we try and do design sessions. They're working under the old system, students are. How do we change that, or how are you changing that? I guess by sending them off to employers for 6 months.
Yeah, well, in some cases it's that combination of experience and education. How is it interwoven? So people know co-op, that's a powerful model, right? There's only a handful of schools in the US and even worldwide that are doing co-op at scale, but that's largely for a traditional residential student. You kind of rotate in and out. Maybe you take 5 years to complete your education. What about for working professionals, working adults? We've built something called the Experiential Network, where we now have employer participation in projects that are interwoven into a professional master's degree, undergraduate degree completion, So there's that blurring of what can the employer role be, and can we have capstones and other things. That reminds me, when you talk about experience, I know with Parchment, Elon University has done some interesting things with an experiential transcript. And if we're going to have all these new sorts of transcript and credential, we haven't talked as much about micro-credentials, right? But we need some standards, and not just technological standards, but when you look at the history of higher education and how accreditation came about, partly in response to, well, you know, we're going to have bachelor's degrees now, and we're going to make that consistent in the early 1900s. And prior to that, the PhD, when there were new forms of credential, and we really only have 4 or 5 major forms that are serving 25 million students a year in US higher ed, we've needed some standardization. And so there's a tremendous opportunity, and it's probably appropriate for an innovation and experimentation to have all these new credentials with new names, new lengths, new depths. But if there's a proliferation without any sort of organization, you know, voluntary or otherwise, by players in the ecosystem, accreditors, groups of employers, industry associations, you know, it may be challenging for employers to then interpret it, because these things are often.
So the Lumina Foundation has done a nice job of organizing some of this work under the Connecting Credentials umbrella that Matt talked about this morning. And one of the big questions is what does a new accreditor look like in a world where you're piecing together maybe from multiple institutions your learning journey? What should that look like, or who should decide?
I'm excited. I know there's a session later on employers as accreditors, and that world I think is just opening up. But what underlies it is maybe not only employers, but third parties in general, right? Through the transparency of data, you have a system that's out there somewhere that shows people that graduated from a certain institution, kind of how they progressed professionally. You know, we're going to see these third parties, basically the evolution of that kind of rankings architecture, where there's more data available, things are more transparent, and then therefore there's going to be a lot of opportunity.
So let's ask the audience at this point, and I wanted to get by a show of hands, where you all fall on the spectrum of Sean's vision or vision of how long this will take.
That's an ideal. That's a great vision.
Yeah, so it's an ideal. So just to say again, it's basically where students would be able to mix and match a set of episodic learning experiences and episodic micro-credentials and present it as a credible hiring credential. Let me ask how many, I'll tell you what the spectrum is going to be. How many of you see that as being less than 5 years, 5 to 10 years, or more than 10 years? So 3 choices, okay? So let's start with the optimists. Who thinks it's less than 5 years before we'll see this? All right, I love these people. Okay, how many think it's 5 to 10 years? And how many think it's more than 10 years? Okay. Oh, Matt. This is why you created Parchment, yeah. Okay, with that, let's take a few questions or comments. Yeah. If we have a few minutes, yeah. Any for Sean? Any? Yes, here. I think they're running the mic over to you.
So I had raised my hand to say less than 5 years because of the way that you framed the question, which was, you know, can these things be a credible hiring credential? And I think that the things that we're doing at the University of Arizona, we're working with actual employers who are hiring our students. So therefore, it's credible to them because they're actually the subject matter experts who are working with us to provide this. So is it nationally going to be recognized? Maybe not, but certainly by our local already engaged employers, that will be, some of it will be recognized next year, you know, so that's just a comment, or maybe it's just when you think about standards, national standards, that takes longer, but I don't know even for sure if that's honestly, if it's necessary, right? I think it depends what the goal is. So.
Abra's presenting this afternoon on the collaboration badge that University of Arizona is doing. All right.
Great, thank you. So you mentioned Elon's experiential transcript. I was wondering if in your conversations with employers, if you talked with them about co-curricular records, co-curricular transcripts, and what their thoughts on it are.
Yeah, I think that's an area that's valued, especially as having experience as part of your college study, I'll call it, is growing, right? All those numbers about participation in internships, et cetera, are going up. So we need some way that it becomes documented. The challenge there seems to be partly the business process on the employer side. How do they hire? How do their applicant tracking systems work? Can they accept a portfolio? Because they look at it often as a volume game at the top end of the screening process. They have 100+ applications for every job as the average. And so they don't have time, if it's not in a sort of database and easy to work with system, to sort through and understand what's under the surface. Maybe when you get down to 3 or 4 candidates, you can then begin to dig in. But I would imagine, as probably most of us do, a world perhaps in 5 to 10 years, right? We'll see, where you can basically click and drive down onto any of these details. You can have as little detail as you want, you can have as much detail as you want, and there'll be something captured under the surface. But I think we do need to consider if you gain experience or knowledge in the workforce, right, as part of a internship framed by your university or just on your own, or if you're a professional, and if you study in a course, those things are kind of blurring in terms of what that then means that you can present.
Who's best situated to break through with the Uber app for digital credentials?
I wish I knew the answer. I could make millions.
You're supposed to say Parchment, but
yeah, Parchment.
No, just kidding. But no.
Well, so I think it's a key question, because even the technology ecosystem, the startups, the standards is so early. It's part of what makes it exciting and dynamic. I think you're going to have many, and then there's a question of, will there be sort of a consolidator in the end, a platform, right? Or does a major tech behemoth like a Microsoft's already bought LinkedIn, right? Does Amazon make a play?
Does it need to be nonprofit? That's the thing that worries me. I'm all for private-public partnerships, but does it need to be nonprofit to be for the societal issues, from privacy to accreditors? We don't have private accreditors right now. I mean, I guess you do in some markets, but what do you think? Can it be?
That's a great question.
Can it be a LinkedIn? That's kind of scary.
You could have many different approaches, and maybe that's the future of quality assurance, or what the role is or isn't of government at this sort of time and pivot point in policy. It's a big opportunity when wholesale approaches are being rethought.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think do we have time for another question? Okay, one more here. Oh, sorry.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes. Sorry.
Thank you both for this session and for the earlier one. I think they've both been thoughtful and illuminating. I'd like you to carry it further in the context of equity. And if you think back to what Jeff was briefly pointing out to us about where the growth in the population is in terms of those who will be needing and seeking some form of post-secondary learning. And then imagine the world you've just been talking about, in which we're creating a vibrant and complex, multifaceted new mode of learning and mode of credentialing. Just play out for us the equity or inequity implications of what we're talking about. And I have to say that behind my own question is my observation that the people who most loved the MOOCs that I know personally had PhDs.
Right. Yeah, I wish I had solutions, but there's huge equity issues, as I referenced earlier, and even implicit in a lot of what we're talking about is sort of the professional level jobs, bachelor's and above jobs. I personally believe, well, what if we really rethought the associate degree, right? Different pathways. Earlier, how does K-12 link with all this, right? And have an unbundling or a stacking all across this, where right now, even in the innovation we're talking about, it's still within a framework of, okay, high school diploma, and then, if you're lucky, you'll move beyond that, and we'll get you to complete, and then, the employers are often looking for a master's degree. How can we really, truly break apart different offerings and ideally collaboratively work, higher education, policymakers, and employers to have employers and hiring managers, right? It's not always an HR leader, but hiring managers on the line appreciate and work in a new way when it comes to how they consider educational qualifications. That's cultural change. And cultural change is very hard work versus just being able to say, hey, here's a new product, here's a new technology, we hope that you'll use it.
And I would just like to add, because we focus on the equity piece, that adaptive technology needs to push to improve advising at scale for the non-institution-based learner. I think that would be a key piece for us all to think about, that we may have some ability to operate in that lane. So, with that, I think I'm really sorry for the people who were sitting behind here if we didn't feel like we were playing to this side of the room. But thank you very much for listening to our fireside chat.
Yeah.
Thank you.